The 16th century was a time of great upheaval in Europe, one that would forever change the course of history. At the heart of this transformation was a man named Martin Luther, a German monk, theologian, and professor whose challenges to the Catholic Church sparked a religious revolution that would alter the fabric of European society. The story of Luther and his defiance of the Church is one of conviction, controversy, and ultimately the birth of Protestantism. But how did Luther, a figure of piety and scholarship, come to oppose an institution that had been the center of Christian life for over a millennium? And what impact did his actions have on the Church and the world? To understand Luther's role in the Reformation, we first need to look at the state of the Catholic Church in the early 1500s. For centuries, the Church had wielded immense power over both spiritual and political matters in Europe. It had grown rich and influential, with the Pope at its helm, claiming authority not only over the souls of the faithful, but also over kings, emperors, and nations. However, this power was not without its critics. Over time, the Church had become increasingly corrupt, and its practices began to draw suspicion from many of its followers. One of the most contentious issues in the Catholic Church during this period was the sale of indulgences. Indulgences were essentially pardons for sins, bought with money, which according to church teachings would reduce a person's time in purgatory. The sale of indulgences had become a widespread practice by the early 16th century, and this is where Martin Luther's story begins. Luther was born in 1483 in Eisleben, Germany, and entered the monastery at the age of 21. His decision to become a monk came after a life-changing event. One night, as Luther was traveling, he was caught in a violent thunderstorm. Fearing for his life, he vowed to become a monk if he survived. He kept his promise and dedicated himself to a life of prayer and study, later earning a doctorate in theology. Despite his deep commitment to the faith, Luther struggled with feelings of guilt and inadequacy, believing that no amount of good deeds or penance could ever bring him the peace he sought with God. Luther's quest for spiritual assurance led him to study the Bible in great depth, and it was through his reading of the Scriptures that he began to question many of the teachings and practices of the Church. One of the most significant realizations he had was the doctrine of justification. The Catholic Church taught that salvation could be earned through a combination of faith and good works, such as acts of charity, prayer, and penance. However, Luther came to believe that salvation was a gift from God, granted through faith alone, not by human efforts. This idea, known as justification by faith, was the cornerstone of his theological views and would later become a central tenet of Protestantism. Luther's growing dissatisfaction with the Church culminated in 1517, when he wrote his famous 95 Theses. These were a series of statements criticizing the sale of indulgences and other church practices that Luther saw as corrupt or unbiblical. The most famous of these was his objection to the idea that indulgences could be used to buy one's way into heaven, a practice that seemed to him to undermine the true message of the gospel. Luther's theses were not intended as an outright rebellion against the Church, but rather as a call for reform. He posted them on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, where he was a professor, in the hope of sparking an academic debate. What happened next would change history forever. Luther's ideas quickly spread across Europe, thanks to the recent invention of the printing press, which allowed for mass distribution of texts. The Catholic Church was alarmed by Luther's growing influence, and soon Luther found himself at odds with the most powerful institution in Europe. In 1520, Pope Leo X issued a papal bull known as Exsurge Domine, condemning Luther's teachings and demanding that he recant. Luther refused, famously burning the papal bull in a public display of defiance. His refusal to back down marked the point of no return. Luther had effectively excommunicated himself from the Catholic Church. The conflict between Luther and the Church escalated when, in 1521, Luther was summoned to the Diet of Worms, an imperial assembly where he was asked to recant his writings. Standing before Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Luther made his now legendary declaration, "Here I stand, I can do no other." His refusal to recant led to his excommunication, and he was declared an outlaw. However, Luther was not arrested, thanks to the intervention of his protector, Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, who arranged for Luther to be hidden in the Wittenberg castle for his own safety. While in hiding, Luther continued his theological work. One of his most important achievements during this time was the translation of the New Testament into German, making the scriptures accessible to the common people for the first time. His translation of the Bible became a cornerstone of the Protestant Reformation and played a key role in the development of the German language. Luther's ideas continued to spread, and the Reformation began to gain momentum. The movement was not just a theological dispute, it was also a social, political, and cultural revolution. Many people were drawn to Luther's teachings because they offered a new understanding of salvation, one that was not dependent on the church or its rituals. The idea of salvation by faith alone resonated with a wide range of people, from peasants to nobles, and Luther's emphasis on the authority of the Bible challenged the church's monopoly on religious knowledge. At the same time, the political climate of Europe played a significant role in the spread of the Reformation. Many German princes saw Luther's ideas as an opportunity to assert their independence from the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Some princes embraced Lutheranism as a means of gaining more control over their territories, while others were motivated by a desire to confiscate church lands and wealth. The rise of Lutheranism was thus closely intertwined with the growing sense of nationalism in Europe and the desire for greater political autonomy. The Catholic Church, for its part, was not blind to the threat posed by Luther's ideas. In response to the Reformation, the Church initiated its own series of reforms, known as the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563, was a key moment in this process. The Council reaffirmed Catholic teachings on issues such as the sacraments, the authority of the Pope, and the role of tradition in the Church. It also took steps to address some of the abuses that had provoked Luther's criticism, such as the sale of indulgences. However, the Counter-Reformation was not enough to stop the spread of Protestantism. By the time of Luther's death in 1546, the Reformation had already led to a permanent split in the Christian world. The Catholic Church would remain dominant in many parts of Europe, but Protestantism had taken root in Germany, Scandinavia, and parts of England. The religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants would continue for centuries, culminating in wars, persecutions, and a reshaping of the political and cultural landscape of Europe. Luther's impact, however, was not just limited to religious matters. His emphasis on the Bible as the ultimate authority and his challenge to the Church's monopoly on spiritual power laid the foundation for the modern world. The Reformation contributed to the rise of individualism, the spread of literacy, and the growth of new ideas in philosophy, science, and politics. It also set the stage for the development of the modern nation-state, as rulers in Protestant countries gained more control over their territories and broke away from the authority of the Pope. In the end, Martin Luther's confrontation with the Catholic Church was more than a theological dispute. It was a moment of profound change that would reverberate throughout history. Luther's insistence on the primacy of Scripture, his challenge to the authority of the Pope, and his call for a more personal, faith-based relationship with God would influence not only the future of Christianity, but also the development of Western civilization itself. His legacy endures to this day in the Protestant denominations that trace their roots back to his teachings and in the broader cultural and intellectual shifts that his Reformation helped to catalyze.